All right, and for more on this, we're joined in the studio by gender activist Ntsiki Sisulu. Thank you so very much for joining us here on the Afro Breakfast.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Well, as a start, let's talk about yesterday's events and all the marches that took place, for gender activism and in sort of support of women who have suffered some sort of abuse and feminism we've seen, whether it's been on the rise or whether there's been more reporting on the issue of feminism. What's your view on these protests and marches and pickets? Will they help in terms of addressing the real sort of issues that women are faced with on a daily basis?
I think, as President Ramaphosa said yesterday, they certainly raise awareness. That's one. The importance is that how do we take it forward, right? And you'll know that way back in 1913, when Charlotte Maxeke were protesting against past laws, they later then formed the Bantu Women's Organization to organize themselves as women to, one, yes, again, protest against past laws, but also to actually advocate for increased in wages because of the low wages that women were being paid. So in terms of women's movements, that has been an issue that has happened. In 1954, we know that the Women's Charter was put in place, in which women were calling for similar things, that there be peace in the country and certainly be peace in the world, but also equal pay for work of equal value between men and women. So these are documents that have been in place and that the country has certainly worked towards. And if one does not begin to be as active as the women of 1956, we know that change sometimes does not happen, but it certainly brings it to the forefront, gives it the attention that is necessary. Yes, as government, for example, in 2000, the National Gender Policy Framework was put in place, but that was 18 years ago. The effectiveness of that remains questionable. We know, for example, that as South Africa, we've had best practice in terms of having gender focal points and national gender machinery, but it hasn't been that effective simply because the institutional mechanism and institutionalization thereof has not been effective. And these are issues that have been raised year after year after year. And issues of violence against women are at the core of what women are really struggling for. If we are to realize the Constitution as it sets out, that South Africa is really going to be a gender equal, non-sexist, non-violent South Africa, and women continue to face the brunt of that violence, it is these kinds of protests that continuously bring it to the fore, because a society that is patriarchal tends to add women on, as you would have seen with the centenary of Albertina Sisulu. It becomes an add-on. So this allows it to be front and center, but also, most importantly, to be priority and continuously so.
What's at the root, do you believe, of this continued gender inequality? And I'm glad that you spoke about, I'm glad that you spoke about the women of 1956 who were protesting against, past laws and the inequalities at that time. But, it doesn't seem as though, we've reached a point where there is gender equality at all. And that's why I suppose that we're still having we're having to have these kinds of protests and awareness and all of that. What is the actual root of the issue? Is it an economic issue? What exactly is the problem that we're faced with in terms of having this patriarchal society, never-ending patriarchal society, or a country that we live in, really?
Social, economic, political, financial. There are lots of reasons as to why the way in which we're socialized, essentially, and the beliefs that we take on board. We're at a cultural and religious level, at a traditional level, and we perpetuate them, whether it is, as women get married, what they're expected to do, as their husbands pass on, what they're expected to do, and who then actually is the enforcer of those norms and practices. That culture in itself is supposed to be dynamic, and it actually is if you allow it to be, but we can, as society and as various cultural and ethical groups, perpetuate that kind of behavior that then entrenches it. But there is a study that was done by the University of Cape Town, commissioned through government at the time, around the root causes of gender-based violence in the country, and that is how we got to a point of having the 2013 to 2018 program of action. But it wasn't the first program of action for no violence against women and children or gender-based violence in the country. And I think what the march did yesterday, as they presented the memorandum, they were actually restating, but also putting forward the need to have action around that which government has spoken about for so long. Why have these not worked? 365 days plan of action for no violence again to end gender-based violence in the country was first put forward back in 2006 with Phumzile Mlambo being one of the pioneers of that. But that has not taken root, nor has it given us the desired result of actually having, as you asked the question, a society that is truly non-violent. And you know, violence, of course, happens in the home, in the closest spaces, with people who often know us and that we know as well, and that becomes a little bit difficult for government to be in that space. But if the response of government, prevention, yes, for advocacy, but the response of government and the entire justice system needs to be such that secondary victimization is prevented, but that it is seen to the end that perpetrators of violence against women are actually brought to book.
How possible is it? I mean, you talk about the enforcers of these norms. You know, how possible is it to address, you know, these this patriarchal sort of status quo that we have when, for example, I would think that some of the enforcers are ourselves as women. Let me give you an example. If you go to a wedding, for example, there's always that auntie who's going to tell you, Begazela, you know, a woman's place is this and that. You know, there's always a woman who's going to tell you that if you're not married and you don't have this husband, you know, you'll never, you know, you're somehow below the rest of, you know, the women that are married. There is that patriarchal rhetoric that is pushed, I think, perhaps by women themselves. And so how do we address that within ourselves?
Well, we have choices as women, and you'll know that some social pressure is that women do want to get married, and they will subject themselves to some of the cultural norms. And you'd also find that there are those who will rebel against them, and it will be within their in-laws that they will find that they get the harshest treatment, the most unfair treatment. I do hesitate at the narrative of women being the perpetuators. Yes, in part they are, but patriarchy remains an ideology that sees men as supreme, as men as heads of households, and what men say goes, and therefore you find that women are then carrying out that which has been set forward. But there is an element of truth, and there is an element of real lived experiences for many of us, including myself, in terms of how women treat other women at weddings, but also at time of death, whether it's the issue of the mattress and how it comes out of the bedroom to the lounge, Lord knows. And, you know, so we have all these norms that we perpetuate on our own and need to interrogate them, but need to also allow women to have the choice not to. And not have to label them as, you know, a feminist, a radical person, a rebellious person. But as the president said, we should keep on being loud, being heard, being active, and being radical.
And speaking of being loud, being heard, being radical, there is, and I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's this sort of increase or growth in feminism, I suppose, or feminist movement. Or perhaps it was always there. I mean, you talk about 1956, you know, perhaps they were not calling themselves feminists at the time. What do you make of this sort of warped perception by some that, you know, feminists are this group of angry women that, you know, hate men? And I've even heard the term men bashers. What is your view on that kind of narrative?
Well, I suppose it goes back to the whole idea that we need to look at what men's perspective is about what women think. It's really about women's rights. You know, feminism is about what the rights of women are and having a focus on that. If you remember, the Department of Women, when it was established, it was the Department of Women, Children and People with Disabilities.
Yes.
It was the very women who said what we had actually asked for was the Department of Women to look at how policy, legislation, programs, budgets of government are affecting women in particular. Because if you're actually to arrive at a point at which gender mainstreaming as a strategy is used, you have to look at the differential between how you apply your policy to men, to women, to girls and boys, and you would know that those effects would be different. You know, I always make the very simple example of water in the bathrooms and toilet paper. You know, you will always spend more money in the women's bathroom for water and toilet paper, and you wouldn't necessarily for men, just at a simple, basic level. So, and as you go up, of course, you know, the issue of sanitary dignity becomes absolutely critical as well. And so what it is that women pay for, that is, would be different than what men would pay for. And therefore, how do you design the policy such that it allows us to reach a point of women empowerment and a gender equal society?
You know, I want to talk about you know, the pressing issues facing women. Obviously, I think the biggest one is femicide. Do you believe that there is a rise in cases of femicide, or is it a case of that we've put more focus on it or more spotlight on it, and we're really seeing how bad the situation is for women? I mean, where do we stand in terms of, you know, statistics, in terms of women abuse, femicide? Are we seeing a rise in that, or it really was this bad to begin with? It's just that we now can see and have a clearer picture of what's going on.
I think it goes back to your question of how one is told to begazela. For example, you know, stick it out, it's going to be okay, until you wind up dead, you know, as women in terms of marriage and issues of femicide. But in the country, we did have the Special Rapporteur on gender-based violence, and one of the calls that she had coming from the United Nations in Geneva in particular was that all countries need to have a femicide watch. It does help put the spotlight on it, but it also allows us to report it as such. Remember, there's an entire value chain of issues of violence and how we report it and how we record it. So a person may go to a hospital and may present themselves as having been injured in one way or the other. It may not necessarily be recorded as a domestic violence injury or an abuse injury. And somebody who may die may not necessarily be recorded as having died because of femicide, right? It may be said it was an accident or however. So the consciousness is around saying, can we actually calculate the cost of violence against women and femicide? Remember, there is also a cost to reporting and speaking out for a lot of women. And women have to consider the cost of, yes, finance in their own homes, how are they going to live, and how are their children going to live. And actually they risk their lives because of the cost of speaking out. So it's a multi-layered issues of violence against women, issues of which ultimately bring us to femicide. But it's also the brutality and the nature of violence against women that we find quite shocking in the country. And indeed, it becomes important that as we go along, that men take it upon themselves, which some men's organizations have done so, but women equally are taking it upon themselves to say, look, we are the ones who are facing the brunt of this. Yeah. We will therefore speak out. However, sometimes we don't want to lose the message because of the messenger, and it becomes important that there are more advocates for no violence against women and children, so that we actually are able to, one, have a baseline on these femicide, but begin to decrease the number of femicide in the country.
I wonder if it's fair for me to ask, you know, where we really place the blame for what women are going through. I mean, we heard the president yesterday apologizing on behalf of men, saying that, you know, he apologizes for, you know, all these cases of femicide and the abuse of women and what men have subjected what men have subjected women to. I wonder, is it really even more of a societal issue? Is it necessarily, you know, the men themselves? Where are we battling? Where do we take that blame? Is it government? I mean, you know, one of the things that were asked for yesterday at the marches was that government, you know, put in policies that will, you know, help to prevent these rising numbers of femicide. Where do we actually focus and put the blame?
It's a societal issue. Can never be a government issue alone. Government may have a greater responsibility in terms of the legislation, the institutionalization, the monitoring thereof, and putting in place the necessary resources to make sure that happens. You will know in terms of statistics that the crime statistics were always with SAPS, and there was a talk and a move towards making sure that they go to Statistics South Africa so that they can get official data, because it was felt that perhaps SAPS is not reflecting the true picture. And of course, government is constantly looking at those kinds of inputs from civil society in general, so that we can begin to have more accurate reflection of data. the blame also must lie in the people who are perpetrators of violence. We cannot shy away from that. The men who perpetrate violence in their homes, and the man who flings a child off, an informal settlement because he wants to make a cause. That in itself, you can't unsee that. So the blame lies in society as a whole. But you must remember that how many generations deep the effects of a violent South Africa that we come from have gone, in terms of an apartheid South Africa, where in order for us to be heard, we actually had to throw stones way back in 1976 and before that. And there is a report that was released by Wits University and the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation called The Smoke That Calls. And the women yesterday must be commended, as the president said, for actually not having to burn things down in order for them to be heard, but simply to stand your ground. And that's what it takes for women most of the time, or all of us in society, is to stand our ground without being destructive, and disruptive in such a way that actually you're causing more damage to even your cause than you would to further your cause. So the blame lies in, for example, how we live, the spatial planning in this country, how far people have to walk. Even this morning, as you guys would know, as you come in, there are many people walking to work, 4 o'clock in the morning, on their bicycles at 5 o'clock in the morning. All of that has got to do with a lot of spatial planning that we've inherited. And in the process, a lot of criminal elements do seep in. And that is our history. As a country, we should know that people are indeed wounded at very many levels, and most of which it's at a very deep psychological level that we really need. And as women spoke yesterday, they are indeed very angry. And you can imagine the men who are abusing, that they too have issues in terms of how angry they might be, but women can never be their outlet for their anger.
And so where do we go from here in terms of addressing gender-based violence and, of course, child abuse? Because my fear, or maybe concern or worry, is that, okay, August is Women's Month, and of course, every day we'll keep talking about women's issues, and we'll keep talking about what should be done. Where, we can have these proposals for summit, as was done yesterday to the president, and I heard the president saying that, we will consider that. But I worry that August ends, and then, we keep hearing about these issues, and we hear more cases. So I think, as a start, where do we begin? Where do we go?
The memorandum that the women presented for the total shutdown actually began to give some direction that government has been trying to take but not taking fast enough. And as I indicated, if, for example, you don't say the speed limit is 100, that is an institutional mechanism. If you don't change it because of the number of people that die and reduce it to 80, that's an institutional mechanism. That's a rule that you put in place. The same process needs, at a simple level, the same process needs to be put in place. When President Ramaphosa came in as Deputy President of the country, one of the documents he had asked for was a document regarding the national strategic plan on gender-based violence and the proposal to form a council on gender-based violence, as civil society had brought it on board. However, there were considerations, and there still needs to be conversations and consultations, because we are a consultative democracy, where we are saying, what kind of a structure? Let's not just have another structure for the sake of it. Let's have a structure that's going to be most effective. And the Department of Women is tasked with that, and the memorandum speaks to that. That the department, it's not that it's doing it only now, but you must remember it's been the most under-resourced department, yet has the greatest mandate of ensuring that women empowerment and gender equality, gender mainstreaming, gender responsive budgeting happens in every single department, in all state agencies, and indeed in the private sector. So where do we go from there is to begin to ensure that the consultations that we engage in begin to bring us to where a collective consensus can allow us to say this would be the most effective tool. But if the tool is effective, it has to be monitored, it has to be evaluated so that we can continuously improve, particularly around prevention and around response and around treatment, right? And you would also know that the organizations that have begun to move to what we're calling secondary accommodation. So it's not that there aren't moves. So you can move out as a woman, but sometimes it takes you longer to settle again. So you need a place where you can be for another year. That in itself is another mechanism that will cost us as a government, but will be absolutely necessary to help women transition from areas where where they have been terribly abused and be safer and do that. So the work of an institution like the Department of Women, the Commission for Gender Equality, the Chapter 9 institution, are instrumental. Parliament as an oversight institution, the judiciary as one that would ultimately hand out sentences, would be all absolutely instrumental. So all of us throughout the year cannot say Women's Month helps us, yes, to highlight, but we cannot say we start and we end during Women's Month at all, because we're women 24 hours of the day.
All right, thank you so much for that great insight. We appreciate having you on the show, and Ntsiki Sisulu, gender activist. We appreciate your time.